I was told to speak about domestic violence in general by Abdullahi, and I was like, that's not my expertise, but I can speak about how domestic violence is presented in mainstream cinema. And domestic violence is actually something that is very, very little, that is something really sort of that is not really represented in cinema. That's actually the point. And when it is represented, there is always a trouble. So the issue of women in cinema is actually something that is that has been the main topic of study in film studies, and some of you who have taken some film classes are already aware of that. But the issue on gender is usually about the representation of women and how women are actually objectified in cinema. And this sort of idea of objectification actually takes its roots from the idea that cinema and media actually are the ideological state apparatuses by Althusser, who did talk about how media and cinema represented the ideas or the ideology of the state. And that is one of the reasons, of course, why issues about gender or troubles about gender usually are also reflected in cinema. And this idea of objectification, we see that in a lot of mainstream films. In a lot of mainstream films, the female characters are almost always there with their looks, and they're usually the very passive characters. They don't have much role in the story, but they're there for the male gaze to be enjoyed. And actually, another problem about women in terms of the media is also the women's labor in the industry, in the sense that they are very rarely acknowledged, especially throughout the, let's say, the beginnings of film history. You get to see a lot of female workers working behind the cameras, a lot of female filmmakers, in Turkey as well, were never acknowledged. Their names are actually kind of erased from history in many of the cases. Sabahat Filmer is, for example, one of them. She was the wife of Cemil Filmer, one of the first filmmakers in Turkey, and her name almost never gets mentioned in film history because of this usual reason that women are invisible from behind the camera, but they're visible in front of the camera. And one of the things that is invisible is another thing that is invisible is the domestic violence, of course. This invisibility is very probably very problematic, especially in the beginnings of cinema. I'm a film historian myself, and that's why I usually talk about film history. So in the beginning of, let's say, of film history, we get to have this idea about cinematification of the world, where film theorists and film scholars talk about how cinema changed our perception, how the invention of cinema in late 19th century actually made the sense that anything can be filmed. A lot of the filmmakers, a lot of the cinematographers from this late 19th century and early 20th centuries, they filmed almost anything. A lot of topics were covered. from the Spanish bullfights, for example, to some, let's say, graveyards in Istanbul. And one of the very few things, and possibly the only thing that didn't probably find place in cinema was the domestic violence. And that's one of the problematics of writing film history as well. So the idea that domestic violence didn't find place in cinema or in films is, of course, there are two things. First of all, the idea that family is sacred, the idea that the family is something to be protected no matter what. And that is why, of course, the violence shouldn't get out of the house. The violence shouldn't escape the house. The violence shouldn't be talked about outside the house, outside the safe, the so-called safe structures of the people's homes. And another thing is, of course, the very idea that domestic violence is possibly among the most horrible types of violence we can imagine, in the sense that because it takes place in a place where you are supposed to be safe, or the safest, it makes the victims feel like they can never feel safe out in their lifetimes, because if you don't feel safe at home with the people who are closest to you, how can you feel safe outside of it? So these are the basic sort of reasons why domestic violence is really sort of neglected in films and in film history. And another thing to probably to be mentioned in this case is I was telling you how unsafe it feels to have violence at home. When I was thinking about this topic, one of the few things that that struck me was, and I didn't think about this before, but one of my favorite authors, Stanley Kubrick, has sort of films that actually have very different genres. He made films about, he made thrillers, he made film noirs, he made science fiction, he made films about marriage or family life, or dramas in general, and he only has one horror film, and that horror film is The Shining, and it's about, a father losing his mind and sort of murdering his children. And I would like to show you this clip that actually sort of is one of the other problematics of talking about domestic violence, the idea about let's say the villain having its excuse to attack. And that's also, whenever we see domestic violence being represented in films, that's something we usually see as well, the justification of this violence. And Stanley Kubrick, as a very, of course, sort of cynical and intellectual filmmaker, he sort of uses this excuse, in my opinion, in a very ironic manner, and I would like to actually show you that. This is so the father figure in the film is actually sort of writer, and he and his family moves into to this hotel where he is trying to write a novel. And his wife discovers this is all he wrote for the novel. And that was the husband played by Jack Nicholson. So yeah, talking about domestic violence, we have right. So yes, in The Shining, what happens is the man's excuse is that he has to work hard for his family, and in my opinion, Kubrick sort of kind of shows it in a very sort of subtle manner, so as to yes, criticize this idea that that's of course not an excuse, but also in a sense by, for example, if you sort of paid attention, the first time we get to see the writing and the woman from afar is where we get to see the perspective of the man, actually. So the camera actually assumes the man's position, and that's what also makes us feel like, so it sort of puts us in the position of the man as well. And as I said before, this is of course done in a very sort of ironic manner, but at the same time, by choosing, I forgot the name of the main actress, by choosing the actress as the wife, who is shown and whose looks as being ugly has been sort of emphasized throughout the film, is also another sort of excuse for the guy beating her up. That's also another sort of idea, you know, his eyes are, you know, he's always trying to sort of engage with other women in the story, and that sort of doesn't happen. So, you know, the idea that his wife is ugly and that he has to feed his family sort of drives him crazy, and that, you know, he sort of wants to kill everyone in his family. So, talking about the domestic violence and media figures, I kind of remembered also the big figures in the very popular figures in media, like Woody Allen, for example, or İbrahim Tatlıses from the Turkish case, who are famous about domestic violence, in the sense that Woody Allen molested his daughter, and İbrahim Tatlıses famously, or let's say notoriously, beat his wives up. And still these figures are sort of represented in media as being cute, sweet, you know, sympathetic creatures that sort of that are being defended by the media in a very sort of actually passionate manner at the same time. you would think they would lose their popularity by all these sort of news coming up, but that sort of actually doesn't happen. And it's the case with Bill Cosby as well, I guess, recently. Although I think his situation isn't about the domestic violence, but, still it's about violence against women. So according to a study done by Nilgün Abisel, only 7% of the Turkish films actually show domestic violence. So, and half of these films actually show rape, and that actually means, it's not possibly to criticize domestic violence in the sense that we know most of the rape scenes in media or in TV shows are also sort of shown for the male gaze, not only to sort of criticize the violence, but it's also there to sort of promote some sexual feelings as well. And abuse and rape are the most common sort of forms of domestic violence in these films, and almost all of the time, if there is a beating up or murder, we always also see in these films how these women were also kind of guilty, in the sense that they were sort of making their husbands jealous, or they were being very flirtatious, or they wanted to be film stars. Which is a very sort of popular narrative in Yeşilçam productions, in the sense that the girl escapes from her house, she wants to become a film star, and then sort of she becomes a fallen woman, and then she's usually either raped or beaten up by her husband, by other men that she lives with, and that's a very sort of common theme. And there is another sort of type of domestic violence that is also sort of practiced by the mothers-in-law, which it's a topic that Abdullahi is sort of very familiar with, in the sense that when he took one of my courses, he made a presentation about how Nigerian films actually are very there's a very popular theme in Nigerian cinema where mother-in-laws sort of actually are the monstrous figures who sort of haunt their brides, and that's sort of perhaps not as fantastic or sort of not as surreal as the Nigerian case, because in this case you get to see them as ghosts, right? The mother-in-law dies, but she comes back as a ghost and she sort of attacks the bride, right? That's the storyline in these Nigerian films. In the Turkish case, we have another figure, famous figure, Aliye Rona, who is another sort of famous mother-in-law figure, and a monstrous one in a sense. She's not, although she's not the ghost, or she's not a real monster. She also usually beats her brides up, or she's very sort of violent to them. And that's another sort of form of domestic violence, of course. And I have actually 2 more clips to show, and I have very few words to add. Let me start with this. And I have 2 clips from 2 different Turkish films. One of them is made by a famous Turkish male author. His name is Yavuz Turgul, and the other is actually made by a famous, let's say, feminist filmmaker, Canan Gerede. And these 2 films actually are probably one of the, some of the most famous films that were made in Turkey about domestic violence. And this film is called perhaps Heartache. And what happens in this story is the woman is again a fallen woman. You know, she she works in a nightclub. She sings there. And she's sort of constantly being beaten up by her husband, and actually that's why she sort of escapes from her house and she becomes this sort of fallen woman, let's say. And she sort of has a very subtle, implicit, let's say, love affair with another man who was supposedly going to rescue her. But that doesn't happen in the story. And what I'm going to show you is actually the very sort of bitter part about what happens. So throughout the clip, the guy who beats the woman up, her husband, we see him on the left of the screen. And this is the other guy who was supposedly going to save her. So she decides to leave him, leave her husband. So he's the good guy, but he doesn't do actually anything about saving her. And this is the violent husband, who was actually shown as being very loving. You know, he really loves his husband, his wife, sorry. And that's what happened. And this is how usually media represents the killings of women. You know, it's the love that sort of usually drives men to kill their lovers, their girlfriends, their wives. And that's how it was presented here as well. And here we have another story where actually, if this was a, you know, as I said before, this film was made by a feminist filmmaker. And in my opinion, that is one of the reasons why we get to see the dance scene of the woman. She is actually, this is the life of a very famous Turkish singer, Bergen, who was killed by her, by her lover. And we get to see her dancing here, but in my opinion, if this was made in a more mainstream style, you would get to see her from a close-up, you would get to see how her body looks good, how she was sort of kind of eroticized. But here we don't get to see it. It's shown from a really sort of long shot, and she's not being objectified. But what happens afterwards is she's again in between two men. One of them is again supposedly going to save her, and the other is the man who loves her so much that he actually kills her. I'm not going to show you the entire clip, but you know, the idea that these almost all of these sort of women characters that I showed are being under the dominance of the men who own the house and who own the power and who sort of own the women as well. And in all these stories, they're actually killed because they stayed at home, thinking it was probably safer for them to stay at home. Meanwhile, it turned out to be the other way around. So thank you.